When Valve did a valve and disappeared into their floating fortress stationed above heaven that they built purely using Dota money, they left us simpletons yearning for more of what was offered with Left 4 Dead. Even as it was the herald of era of multiplayer in every last game, whether it fit or not, no one could really fill the same hole that Valve left for some time. It took a while, but after a few years of the collective audience getting blue-balled without a game where half the enemy cast wouldn't be out of place working in an S&M club, some teams rose up to the challenge, making their own takes on the formula. This is where Sweden comes in, giving us Fat Shark, who, after making such hits as those 3 multiplayer games you pretty much can't play anymore, and Escape Dead Island, decided to get their hands on not only a game using the Warhammer property, but one heavily styled after Left 4 Dead with Vermintide. And you know what? They finally got a home run with this one. Which is what I would say if I actually played the first game. But since we're going to be talking about the sequel, which is doing fine 4 years later, and we're getting a 40k version of Vermintide coming soon, I'm going to assume it did quite well. While this game does stick very closely to the original format of Left 4 Dead, it's arguably one of the most unique takes on this style of game. As you may have noticed from some of the footage, it's primarily oriented around first-person melee combat. This may not exactly sound too impressive on the surface, but I'll get into that soon enough once the basics are out of the way. When you start the game, you're immediately thrust into the prologue that admittedly doesn't make much sense without being familiar with the first game. Long story short, your company includes a dwarf, along with an elf, a witch hunter, witch, and an empire soldier. You were captured by the evil rat from the first game, who decided to team up with Chaos to try and destroy the world after you blew up his magic moon. You know, just a normal day in the end times for Warhammer. Once that's out of the way, you return to your keep, where you can then go out on various missions to put a stop to this actual rat fuckery. Each set of 4 missions is its own act, which is just a mini arc that eventually connects itself to a confrontation with a major story boss. Once all 3 acts are done, you head off to the final level. In terms of raw game time, the campaign isn't long in the slightest. It'll likely run you about 7 hours at most, likely less if you don't have much issue, which is a possibility on the earlier difficulties. But the campaign isn't really the reason to get into this game. The missions are set up more so as a backdrop with a drip feed of story and character interactions while you replay them over and over again. The levels themselves are quite simple, almost always consisting of various straight lines, occasional roadblocks to overcome, and usually ending in a big finale with simple tasks like destroy something, move something, or survive something, and so on. These simple missions really work in this game's favor as they rarely get in the way or feel tiring to repeat. This allows the gameplay to be front and center, while the maps act like a way of throwing different kinds of challenges at you. There was also an optional objective during each mission, which adds an extra layer of difficulty. Hidden around are 3 tomes and 2 grimoires, which increase your rewards if you make it to the end with them. While you carry them, they take up slots that prevent you from storing items for later use. In the case of grimoires, you also lose a third of your HP on top of never being allowed to die, or else you lose it for good. In a full book run, that means you can only store 1 healing item, 2 buff potions, and only 2 people are allowed to die, period. And while getting to the end with all this can be challenging enough, finding them without a guide can just be nigh impossible. The tomes tend to be easy enough, hidden away in nooks and crannies that you might find accidentally, but the grimoires are almost always hidden behind crazy puzzles or platforming sections that make it look like you're trying to get out of bounds just to get them. This is one of the shorter but equally obtuse grimoires to get. There's nothing that tells you this rubble in the middle of nowhere has a grimoire in it, let alone to do this specific platforming to get inside. But regardless, it is a fun addition for the first few times you run a new map, as some of the puzzles can be quite fun. But I'll admit that after 100 or more runs of these maps, some of them take a little too much time, so it kind of gets annoying because you're just acting on muscle memory, so you're just wasting time to get to them at that point. When it comes to what you'll be fighting, the threats you'll be seeing are hordes, filled with cannon fodder enemies, elites, which are a much more immediate threat, and specials, which are the classic disablers and area deniers that we all know and love. There's also the less frequent bosses, which are usually random during the levels and finales. The job of the horde enemies is to come in such large numbers and surround you that you have significantly less room to work with. They might not be where a lot of the mistakes happen, but they're also where they tend to end. The elites are there to stop you from shooting through the horde by either preventing your melee weapon from passing through them and soaking up a lot of damage, being unrelentlessly aggressive that you don't have time to attack, or just bonking you on the head and removing almost all your HP. In general, they can be a little bit tough to deal with among all the chaos. Specials, on the other hand, are all fairly simple to take out, but that's only because their impact is much greater and they're the last thing you want to see while you're fighting a horde mixed with some elites, as evidenced by my friend getting absolutely destroyed.
What just killed me? What just killed me?
Bosses are simultaneously the most and least threatening enemy in this game. They are, as you'd expect, beefing enemies who can pump out some considerable damage, while also being highly resistant to being controlled. However, if you manage to take control of the situation, then bosses generally won't be that bad. And this is due in large part to the fact that some classes can pump out a lot of damage if they're not interrupted. So that's a lot of spooky, scary things that you have to fight, and in large numbers. So how are you expected to deal with them all? Well, each of the 5 characters has their own unique repertoire of weapons alongside 3 or 4 different classes. This gives you the ability to pretty much gear up for anything or everything if you choose to generalize. This game has an impressive amount of diversity in the way that each class feels due to how their talents and abilities synergize with the weapons. Want to be the living embodiment of a hate boner that can tank through sheer sustained health? Want to protect your team by playing the most high-stakes game of patty cake of your life? Or maybe you just want to be a sentient wall that repeatedly insults people as they try and break through your guard in vain? There's a class for all of it. Despite the wide variety of classes, it doesn't really fall into the same role structure as the typical tank, DPS, and support. Everyone's still expected to be able to do everything, like ranged focus classes still need to use their melee a good bit in order to protect themselves and cover the flank, or those up front still needing to mark and take out specials as they come in if they're in inconvenient places that the others can't see. So this dynamic ends up being more focused on those who can be in the front line, killing a bunch of enemies or controlling them, those who are better in the back line, like the ranged classes, or those who are more squishy, and an extra slot for utility to kind of bolster the team a little bit further. Some of the playstyles to fill these roles can be really fun. Foot Knight is a frontliner who can stagger anyone out of anything by slapping them with your shield, or giving them a good bonk on the head. He has a talent that can recharge your ability the moment someone goes down, allowing this guy to be able to recover from nearly any bad situation if you can pull it off. And then there's Slayer, who's a class with no ranged options, instead having 2 melee weapons, with a huge damage buff on hit that stacks and an ability that further increases your already boosted attack speed, which can be up all the time if you're aggressive enough. You become an angry blur that throws himself into every battle with little abandon and to eviscerate everything from the knee down. And then we have the Bounty Hunter, who's a ranged character focused around dealing huge burst damage with a guaranteed critical shot every 10 seconds, which can be combined with all sorts of buffs that are triggered by landing crits, allowing yourself to sustain ammo very well throughout a mission and deal a lot of damage downrange. His ability involves pulling out the equivalent of a flintlock pistol loaded with a 50 caliber fragmentation round and absolutely destroying everything on the receiving end if you can line it up with a free crit. And that's only 3 examples. There's so many classes that offer a wide variety of playstyles that it can be hard to find one that you don't like among the 15 base options. Well, now that the basics are out of the way, it's time to put on the big boy pants and start looking into the combat itself. It may not have looked it from all the footage you've seen so far, but this game is fairly technically deep. It just has a habit of not explaining any of that to you, unfortunately. I love it to death, but man, it is weird sometimes. Overall, this game is mostly based on technical know-how, being able to apply that, and having situational awareness. You aren't really punished all that much for not being able to aim well. I mean, good aim helps, but it's not something that you're really tested on constantly, which I do appreciate. To boil it down, the goal is to hit everything and not get hit, because you can be punished really hard for getting hit once. In order to do that, you need to come to grips with things like blocking and dodging. Blocking is pretty straightforward. You hold down a button and block hits. But there's also a fun little quirk to blocking. When you're blocking with anything, even a tiny dagger, it actually protects you from all sides, despite the game hinting that blocking only really works from the front. It sounds silly, but when you get surrounded so easily, it's really nice to be able to hear a sneak attack sound cue, and then just tap the block button and avoid getting hit by something you weren't even looking at. And then there's the dodge. The dodge doesn't really work like you would expect. There are no iframes, and you might even think it doesn't do anything with how little you move and how much phantom range the enemies can have. But it's actually extremely impactful and can pretty much be the sole thing keeping you from getting hit. When you dodge after an enemy has started their attack, you'll disable their tracking. Yep, the reason the enemies almost always hit you is because they just track you constantly during their attacks. It's a weird way of handling it, but hey, it works, so who am I to judge? When it comes to the hitting part, it's all about finding the right move for the right job. You have a light attack chain, a heavy attack chain, and a push attack to work with. Every attack on a weapon is different, so understanding what works against what enemy is pretty important. There's also a lot of specifics to understand, but thankfully it's overall consistent. Sweeps generally hit multiple enemies using the cleave stat with lower damage, while stabs and overheads hit one enemy, but do considerably more damage with armor penetration. Swords like to cleave with damage, hammers like to cleave with stagger, and axes love to not cleave but does lots of armor damage. Everything else tends to be a mix of these. But don't worry if you have a weapon that's mostly stabs, because chances are there is a combo you can do that goes straight to the sweeping attacks. By mixing lights into heavies and vice versa, you can skip around straight to the good stuff. Let's take Kruber's Halberd for example, as it's one of the more complex weapons. The light attack chain is a sweep, a stab, and an overhead strike. The heavy chain is a strong stab, followed by a strong sweep. Neither combo is good for hordes because it's a lot of single target hits. So in order to get around this, we can either do a light attack followed by a heavy attack for an endless chain of sweeps, or we can do a light attack and tap block, which resets your combo to repeat that one swing again. But if you have an armored enemy or a boss shows up, then I can cancel whatever combo I had, do a heavy attack, and then 2 lights, which throws out only single target attacks. So mix that all together with the hordes and enemies, the class abilities, and what you get is a game where your performance really matters and quick thinking can save games.
Stunt ready. This way. Havoc snare. Ugly chaos warrior. One less stunner roar.
It can look downright silly to have one person go against an entire wave of 100 or more enemies and somehow never get hurt just by doing a square dance around them. But man, if it isn't the most satisfying thing to actually sidestep all these attacks, it's probably the best evading is felt in any game. Almost like you're a Dragon Ball character just casually avoiding every attack coming your way, instead of just phasing through the attacks or having some text appear over your head that says you didn't take damage. And through all this talk about mechanics and structure, I haven't once mentioned just how satisfying the melee combat feels. The animations are great, the sound effects are juicy, and most importantly, the view models feel surprisingly accurate. Just to demonstrate how good this feels, I'm going to give you 20 seconds of pure rat-smashing bliss.
Is that all?
Absolutely delicious, isn't it? Gameplay isn't the only thing that's a highlight here. This game actually looks really good. There's a ton of environments and set pieces that really give you a sense of scale for just how small you are in this massive world. Missions like Righteous Stand and Into the Nest are my favorite examples, as they have some of the most standout landmarks and allow you to see your end goal or the progress you've made from several places. And the music in this game is no slouch either. Composed by Jesper Kid, you get a wide variety of very unique and fitting tracks. The chaos in general tend to go with a more tribal war beat, but then you encounter their abomination of a creation, the Bile Troll, and suddenly it switches to distorted sounds and the scratching of string instruments, along with other sounds I can't even describe how they came up with. The main theme of this game has a leitmotif that accompanies pretty much anything your band of heroes do. Win a match, you'll hear parts of it in the reward screen. Escaping, it's largely the same, but backed with a more triumphant and fast-paced beat as you scurry to the end, trying to avoid enemies. My favorite is the version that plays when you're the last man standing. It kicks in immediately, overpowering any horde or boss theme, filled with bombastic energy, but it also has an intimidating aura to it. Even if you aren't paying attention to your team's status, the second you hear this, you know you're probably screwed. You know that if you get tapped by a disabler, it's game over. But you still have the opportunity to squeeze out a save like a goddamn hero. I'm not kidding when I say I love playing classes with high potential for clutch saves, just because I find this music to be so empowering. But enough of the music. This last highlight is one I really didn't expect at all. It's the writing for this game. It's actually quite surprising considering this game is a silly and over-the-top rat-stomping simulator spawned from a series based off cliches and stereotypes. But granted, it's not the story that I'm talking about. The story is extremely basic bad guy plot. I'm talking about the character writing. The characters themselves are very enjoyable and flawed, and they aren't exactly friends, nor are they enemies, and it's fairly ambiguous how much they truly trust one another. They also evolved quite a bit between games. In the first games, they were all just victims of circumstance, who very obviously didn't really care for one another and kind of just wanted to go about their day after they were done. Saltzpyre hired Kruber as a guard to take Sienna to another city to be tried and likely executed, and this dynamic showed. But with their time together and because of what they experienced, they changed a little. Saltzpyre often doubts the Order. He isn't one of the typical, "burn all the heretics and witches," that people might think he would be. He's only mostly that. He often questions his Order and hides some of what he does from them for the sake of progress. After all, a witch hunter captain from the Order of the Silver Hammer would never be caught working with a witch and an elf. Barton seems like an outwardly jolly and altruistic person, but the tiny glimpses of his past paint a picture of a potential compulsive liar who might have done or experienced some less than upstanding things. After all, he used to be part of the elite military regiment of the Ironbreakers, but instead has ended up fleeing society altogether, which includes abandoning his family. Kruber is kind of similar to Barton, but with seemingly little to hide by comparison. He was just a hired gun for Saltzpyre, and after the death of his family post-Vermintide 1, he needed to become a lot closer to the gang, and is probably the only one who's universally liked among them all. Despite Carillion continuing the constant insults and mocking, she occasionally expresses sympathy for the issues of others, and can even go as far as to sound incredibly saddened when one of the characters dies during a match. She's hiding it, and possibly because she knows she'll far outlive them all, so she doesn't want to get attached, but she does care to some extent. Sienna admittedly didn't change too much, outside of probably being slightly less psychopathic, but in a way that's also part of a problem. It's because she never really comes to grips with the addiction to the fire magic she uses because of that lack of change. So overall, this cast of characters all have some burden or flaws with them, and they still don't exactly have the smoothest of relationships, but the way this relationship is handled, it makes all of their interactions really endearing. It's actually the first time in the end times that I've really felt sad, because you don't often get to see a microscopic story like theirs in Warhammer, and it kinda hurts a little knowing that, well, spoilers by the way for The End Times, if the name wasn't obvious, these people are straight up months away from the actual end of the world where pretty much everyone dies. And this is all helped by the sheer volume of character dialogue. Just in the keep alone, there's dialogue if you have multiple people in a party but one person isn't, dialogue if they're alone, dialogue if there's only two people in a party. It all serves to reinforce their relationships and have each character express interest in the lives of others, or just for a few laughs. And man, the voice acting sells this all even further. They could not have picked better people to embody each of these characters. Saltzpyre in particular being the biggest standout because of his unique inflection. Every word he says sounds like the most insidious religious chanting possible, further reinforcing the fact that members of the Order are pretty much trained from childhood to be where they are.
I am straying, Sigma. I need a sign that I still tread the righteous path. One no one can doubt.
If this were any other game, he would absolutely be the twist villain, but in Vermintide, he's arguably one of the most trustable people here. And all of that can be well and good, but I guess I will have to take a moment to talk about some of the worst parts of this game. It does mostly have to do with technical issues, as this game can be very buggy, but there are some gameplay issues that I or other people might have to take issue with. The AI can be absolutely brain dead at times and lead to some inconsistencies in how you fight them. I've had gutter runners just run right at me and never really try and pounce on me while I just smack them in the face with the hammer. Critical sound cues like the sound that plays when an enemy's gonna hit you from out of view can just not work or play too late. The boss aggro sound can fail and result in the boss just doing a 180 and smacking you across the cheeks because you're not prepared. In some cases, the bugs can be harmless and silly, but in others, they can be a real nuisance. It's not the worst thing, but just be ready to shrug a few things off and just laugh about it if you can. And then there's the UI and features in the UI that really should be there but aren't. This game involves a lot of resource management, but it also doesn't give you the status of your teammates that you might need. Like, you could be on half ammo, see an ammo bag, but not really know who on your team is low on ammo because it pretty much only shows you when you're out. And even friendly fire. Friendly fire for some reason has the same damage indicator as getting hit by any enemy. So whenever I get hit with friendly fire, I immediately block and try and look around to see who's behind me only to see that it was my teammate. Which is annoying because that can also put me in some bad situations where I don't see an elite coming from behind to bonk me. But thankfully, all of these issues, at least on the PC version, can be bypassed by mods. And unfortunately, the worst problem is the performance. Now, it is pretty stable in the campaign, but when they add new content, like the Chaos Wastes, they always introduce some really nasty frame drops. I can run this game at 60 FPS in almost every area, but this one map in the Chaos Wastes will just drop me right down to 30 immediately. This is why this video isn't recorded in 60, just because I hope it's not as noticeable. Now that we got the base game out of the way, we can move on to the DLCs and free additional game mode it got pretty recently. To start, it should be mentioned that you don't need to own any of the extra missions in order to play them. So long as someone owns them and is playing on them, you could join them just fine even through quick play. That, and if someone owns the additional enemy faction, they can show up in any mission they play on as well. The gameplay DLCs, with the exception of Shadows over Bogenhofen, always include new weapons, usually one for each character unless it's a class DLC which only has weapons for that character. Overall, the additional weapons are fine and add a lot of variety. The majority of them have their downsides compared to the base game weapons, and the ones that don't have much of a downside are still not that statistically strong that you just have to use it over something else. At least for melee weapons, that is. When it comes to some of the ranged weapons, it does get a bit sketchy, because some of them are just overpowered admittedly. Both of the engineer weapons make it very hard to justify the other choices. The Masterwork pistol has the damage of the handgun with 4 times the fire rate and a magazine size of 6. It has its downsides of harder fall off and a firing delay, but it hardly justifies being able to deal as much elite and boss damage as you can. Equip it on the Ranger Veteran, and you can dump half of a monster's health bar before your 12-second ult is over. Then you have the Cog Hammer, which is essentially the best Barden melee weapon, period. Its light attacks are fast, it has good cleave and stagger, and on top of that, the heavy attacks are pretty good at doing armor damage. It's so silly that you don't even need to use the second melee slot on Slayer because it just does everything. It's unfortunate, but at the very least it doesn't hurt the overall experience too much, even though it does kind of add some power creep at the end of the day and makes certain situations a bit easier than they would have been otherwise. As for the classes, there's currently 3 DLCs as of the writing of this video, and they are all pretty good. They are more complex than the base game classes, but it also kind of results in them being a little more gimmicky or less exciting. Grailite, for example, is kind of just a stat machine that doesn't really feel all that much different from the other Krubers, except for his lack of gun and the ability to just completely shred bosses. The Outcast Engineer is kind of tough to play because of how much time you have to spend fiddling with your minigun, all for the payoff of dealing with hordes and berserkers really well, which isn't exactly a problem that needed solving as well as it does. Sister of the Thorn has some cool potential for either full DPS or full support depending on your talent tree, but unfortunately her non-pure damage abilities are super situational and can also get in the way of your team if you aren't careful. Now that's not to say these classes are inherently boring, because after all, Barton gets a freaking minigun, but those are kind of the reasons why I didn't really play much of these classes after I bought them. There's also a DLC faction that gets added when you buy Winds of Magic, which is the Beastmen. It's a faction that has received a lot of mixed reception, leaning more towards indifference or outright hatred. The problem with this race is that the enemies are almost as plentiful as normal Chaos and Skaven, while also being tankier and more resistant to cleave and staggering than the others are. The boss at Ads is also quite tough, but not really all that fun to fight, as it just locks you into his combos that are all blockable. Other than the health issue, the units are just kind of a nuisance. The archers never hit you or do much damage, except for the one time they do, and it stuns you from behind, causing you to take a few hits. And they also punish you for using the heavy-hitting ranged weapons because they can appear in such large numbers. The standard Baird makes the already tanky beastmen even more of a pain by buffing their HP and planting this banner outside of a horde that you now have to fight through to get to. I am neutral on them overall, but you can probably get an idea why some might not like them. And finally, the DLC maps. There's not a whole lot to say other than I do think they're quite good and add a nice bit of variety to quick play, even if they might not be as balanced as the original Helmgart maps. Some of them are much longer than others, and some of them can also be quite hard, surprisingly. So now for the extra game modes. There's a free one called Chaos Wastes, and a DLC one that comes with Winds of Magic called the Weaves, and is the main focus of that DLC. And I'm not really going to be talking about Weaves because it's actually kind of bad and largely abandoned by the community. The biggest issue with Weaves is that the matchmaking system is layers upon layers of hell, which made it annoying when it came out, and ended up kind of being the death knell as most players dropped it. Its second major issue is that it was a complete reset of character progression with nothing carrying over. Gear progression is something I don't mind as much, but this also reset your character to level 1 essentially. You had to go back in and re-unlock even the temp HP generating talents, which made starting Weaves just not fun. But the Chaos Wastes though, it is the complete opposite. Man, this game mode is so good. The reason I saved this for the very end is because I do consider the main campaign and its DLC missions to be the main meat of this game, and the Chaos Wastes to just be an extra layer of pure chaos, I guess you could say. And it's definitely a really fun experience. It's basically a roguelite inside of Vermintide 2. You have a map that you have to progress through and try and get to the end finale, and each stage has various modifiers to it. These modifiers can be helpful things like spawning more money or healing items, or be difficulty modifiers like never-ending hordes or throwing way more specials at you. They can even have curses from one of the 4 Chaos Gods, which adds some hazard to the stage that can really make shit go sideways, from periodic lightning strikes, which upgrade any enemy caught into it, to timed eggs that you have to kill or else you'll be faced with the constant stream of bosses. Along the way you'll be finding boons, which all grant unique modifiers or extra talents from your skill tree. These will give you modifiers like guaranteed crits for a few seconds when you take damage, or giving you a passive that lets you become invulnerable for 10 seconds and cheat death every 40 seconds. It ends up being a mode where you just hope to get some absurdly insane setup for whatever character you're playing, either turning Barden into a walking AC 130 or making your Kruber into an ability spamming monstrosity who can casually walk up to bosses and spam left click just to shove them off ledges. This mode is where balance goes to die, however, and it's great fun because of that for the most part. The big problem is that some of the most powerful boons work so well with certain classes that you essentially just say GG even if that's your only passive. It can definitely take the fun away from other players when you're just spamming crits every second and it cleans out entire hordes in a matter of moments. I once had an engineer shoot 3 projectiles with each shot of his 12 round per second minigun, where every 4th shot was a crit and each crit exploded, dealing massive flat damage and causing a stagger.
Christ.
Yeah, he killed that boss before the HP bar could even update. Like I said, balance does not exist in the Chaos Wastes, so be prepared to have a shitload of fun, or sometimes no fun at all. So that's Vermintide 2 in its entirety. If you couldn't already tell, I love almost every bit of this game. It's got a good bit of jank to it, but I feel it's a healthy amount of jank that adds more character to the game. And I hope this was able to show you a side of this game that you don't often see when you're just looking at it from the surface. So if you managed to make it this far after randomly finding this video, like, holy shit, thank you so much. This project took quite a while because I have no real experience with any editing software whatsoever, and also a lot of procrastination and all that. So I like to imagine you enjoyed it if you made it this far, or you just really hated me, which is understandable. I love you too. But hey, if you if you liked what you saw here, I got more stuff coming eventually. Life's a bit busy, so it'll happen eventually, I'm sure. There's just one last thing I want to do, actually. It's gonna be a little extra superfluous end of the video segment where I kind of just highlight very specific and just unnecessary detail in games like these if I can. And it's because a lot of the more unique and jank games tend to put way too much detail into completely out of the way stuff for inexplicably no reason. And it's one of those things where you stumble upon it, you're like, I don't know why they did this, but I feel like my life is just better knowing this. And it's a large part of why I like games like these. The first thing I feel I have to point out is the keep itself. Despite you pretty much spend so little time there and really don't have to interact with anything, they put way too much detail into the little bits of this keep. It's actually surprisingly big, with all sorts of various paths leading to and from. And most importantly, they even added a weird jumping puzzle throughout the entire thing. This just gives you another way of getting to the second floor of this place. There's no achievement for it. It's just there to, if you want to have fun, I guess. And each of the heroes actually has a room inside this keep that you can visit, and it says a lot about the characters themselves. You have Saltspire, who lives just straight up in a jail, and there's even like a rat dissection table with all sorts of tools. He has his own little dining area, and his place to study. He's a clean-kept guy, even though he does some really disturbing things. Then you have Kruber, who lives in a very modest shack. It's got all the amenities that you'd hope for, a nice view off a balcony. And honestly, the sweetest little detail is he has like these little wooden figures that shows like two people and a dog. And unfortunately, that's kind of the family he lost in Uberstrike. And you never know this if you didn't actually visit the room itself. That's kind of out of the way. Sienna just lives in a bunch of burning rubble. She doesn't really care, and it really does speak a lot about her. Carillion chooses to be outside, making herself a log tent. And Barton, he has his own little hidden workshop and, bath and all that, filled with lots of food and alcohol. They even included a little room all the way at the very top that acts as the team's tavern. There's a trophy room for all of the relics from the bosses you've killed. And there's even a little secret hideout for a side character you don't really see too often, who paints all the paintings you find during missions. There's also this hourglass you can activate. It just ticks down and makes a noise after a little bit. I guess just to pressure people who are taking too long? Normally in games, when you inspect a weapon, your character plays an animation to look at it from all sides. In Vermintide 2, it's static, except when you move the mouse, your character moves the weapon around so you can get different views. Also, you can see this happen in third person, and this was actually a fairly recent addition for whatever reason.